in terms of study of language. And then in the 2000s, late 1990s and 2000s, we had a kind of another group which focused on learning-oriented assessment. So learning was the focus, and that we should not only use communication for communication purpose, but we should think of assessment assisting learning. This also grew from the assessment group researchers in University College London, Black and William, and I'll show you a little bit about that, who said that we need to use assessment for learning, not assessment of learning, that is insufficient, assessment for learning. So we have a leap forward there. So this is a little bit more of an explanation of grammar translation, then the audiolingual, and the communication. Alongside also came another splinter group, if you like, saying that communication is too big. You know, I mean, communicating in a language is like a big task. I mean, if you try to organize a curriculum or teaching or assessment, it may be, you may get lost in trying to figure out what exactly to do. So how about task-based, where you focus on a single task, where you identify, say, 10 tasks which you want your learners to learn. You teach them that, those 10 tasks, and then you have assessment on those 10 tasks. So these are, you know, things like information gap. So you have information, but another student doesn't have the information. So you have an information gap problem. So you have to tell this other person about something, then that other person listens. And is there a, you know, can you bridge the gap? Reasoning gap, one person has a schedule, the other person doesn't have a schedule. Opinion gap, so one person has an opinion about which is the best restaurant in this neighborhood, but the other person may not know that. And so the focus here is on communication, but it's narrow in focus, it's task-oriented, just one task at a time. And you could have a series of tasks around a theme of restaurants, for example, or reading a book or understanding a schedule, but this is task-based, and it's one task at a time. And you can plan a trip, you can problem solve, you can make a story. These are all different examples that task-based learning does. And there's a significant group of people who believe in this approach, particularly in Japan. There is a task-based learning conference almost every year there, or in other parts of the world. It's very popular. So alongside communication came task-based, and as I said before, learning-oriented assessment. So here the idea is that we can do things much more focused on learning. You know, let's not talk about tasks and so on, but learning. And the way they want to do it is through technology, through situated language proficiency, using a scenario, and I'll give you an example of scenarios in a little bit. Goal is that it's contextualized, it's in a context, and the scenario could get test takers to, or learners to focus on linguistic, topical, socio-cognitive, and other resources. So it's a whole lot, but I'll talk about this in a little bit. The background to this is the group of researchers in London who came up with the idea of assessment for learning. Previously, we were all talking about assessment of learning. What did the person learn is the question. Here the question is, how can we help the learner learn better? How can assessment assist learners? And so they have a set of principles as to how to integrate teaching, learning, and assessment. This was a very powerful group of researchers who influenced a lot of thinking in the UK and elsewhere about teaching and learning. teaching, learning, and assessment. There were also individual researchers who thought about this greatly. One of my colleagues, former colleagues at the University of Hong Kong, Dave Carles, talked about this, and he came up with these three principles. Assessment tasks should be designed to stimulate sound learning practices among students. Assessment should involve students actively in engaging with criteria, quality, and their own performance or peers' performance. And feedback should be timely and forward-looking. So, lots of ideas about how to do assessment for learning. And David was one of them. And the Black and William piece I mentioned earlier was another one. And so we come to this road, a new pathway, if you like, of scenario-based assessment. That idea that maybe in a scenario we can capture many things all in one, and that can help assessment, can also help learning. Now the difference between task-based and assessment and scenario-based is tasks are individual tasks, but in a scenario you have multiple tasks. That's the big difference. So the scenario is a big concept, and you have many tasks under it, getting the language learners or the test takers to reach the goal in that scenario. Okay, so that is the big leap, if you like. Here are some purposes. So generally, there's a problem to be solved. It should be reasonable, realistic for language learners who are young adults or even younger. You could be 10-year-old or 25-year-old or 30-year-old, but it has to be realistic and reasonable. It should be in a social context. You can assess independent skills and integrative skills. There's a lot of controversy or a lot of difficulties many people have with the concept of integrated skills, that is combining two skills, language and listening and speaking, for example, or reading and writing, because many teachers want to have individual scores for listening and individual scores for writing. And it's when it's combined with listening and speaking, they feel, oh, is that a speaking score really? Or is it speaking dependent on some kind of listening? Well, it is kind of complex in a way. Therefore, many assessment institutions have two types of tasks. Independent language tasks, which focus on listening, speaking, reading, writing, almost independently, and integrated language skills tasks, which combine these language skills. So it could be a speaking task, but it's based on some listening. It could be a writing task, it's based on some reading, or the writing task could be based on listening, or it could be based on two other, it could be based on listening and reading. So you have all of those combinations, which I will show you in a bit. So this is the core features are aligned with communicative teaching, it's meaningful, and the third point here is also relevant. It's high on authenticity. Authenticity is the interest in bringing language activities and language content from the real world into the teaching, learning, and assessment world. So we want to have materials that students are engaged in any of these three activities that resemble the content and the assessment tasks that they will see in the real world. So for example, if you're a professional, say you want to become a professional nurse in a hospital, okay, and the hospital says, okay, you look good on paper, in terms of nursing abilities, you've got the right qualifications, experience. Well, we don't know whether you can be a nurse in an English-speaking country. And this is the case with many nurses who apply for nursing jobs in Australia. Nurses are from different parts of the world, like Philippines, India, China, and so on. So the government has a requirement that you pass an English language assessment. So what should the English language assessment be? Should we ask them to write an essay? Should we ask them to write a poem? Sing a song? I mean, what should we do? So the keen interest is in having tasks in the assessment that are authentic, meaning that resemble kinds of activities that nurses might have to perform. So a nurse could be asked to, deal with the patient, get information from the patient, convey information to the patient, provide guidance, assist in filling out forms, kinds of things that nurses do when you go to a doctor's office or when you're in a hospital. So if those tasks are in a test, we say there's high authenticity. So instead of just giving them random reading passages or listening passages or whatever they have, give them tasks and give them content that is close. It could be the same as what they really do. And I'll give you an example of this later on. That is available. Okay, here's an example of how you can construct your assessments. They could be listening and speaking together based on some listening. So the language learners or test takers will have to listen and then they speak. Listen and then they write. Or listen and speak and then they write. If you want to have some reading-oriented activities, you can have reading plus writing. Reading followed by speaking. Or reading followed by speaking and then followed by writing. So you can organize your language skills in this sort of way. And each of the skill areas will be one task in the scenario. So you have a scenario of maybe 3 or 4 tasks. You can have one of each in a scenario. Now this is from Jim Purpura, who's a strong proponent of LOA. He used to teach at Teachers College Columbia, and he has this elaborate framework in which he talks about 2 important issues. A lot of it is things we know, so I won't elaborate on them, but the things that we want to focus on are performance moderators here. What is it that moderates our performance, and what is it that indicates our performance? 2 things in these 2 boxes. Performance moderators and performance indicators. Performance moderators are socio-cognitive dimension of a test taker or of a language learner. The instructional dimension, what instruction has the student received. The context, what is the context of the scenario? What is the elicitation technique used in the test? And what is these indicators are what you finally their performance indicates. So there's a proficiency dimension. If it's through technology, there's a technology dimension. If there's listening, speaking, there's a socio-interactional dimension. And there's always an affective dimension, how people are affected by tests. Some people don't do tests very well, some people perform better when they are given more time or less tasks, or if they have to handwrite or if they type. So there's all kinds of affective dimension issues. Also in terms of content. Some people are affected by some content, some people do better on certain content. So it's a balancing track for an assessment provider as to what content is best for even a small group of people like you, even if it's 50 or 60 people. What's the best content? And if I were to ask you to write down 3 topics that you like to read about or you like to listen about, we will have 100 topics. You see? So the difficulty is for an assessment provider to understand what is the context of the language learner or the language test taker. Are they young people? Are they older people? What is it that they are interested in reading or listening? And how can we bring that into an assessment, in a manageable sort of way? We can't have 100 topics, but we can have a few. But we can have some, arrangements by which we can get, a closer match between a test taker and the test taker's test. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay. So we have all these contexts that Purpura lists. Under context, you have real world, organization, socio-cultural context, Socio-cognitive is the architecture of your cognition. Instruction is what kind of instruction have you received before. Affective is your disposition, as I mentioned, to the tasks and tests. Content. Social interaction, very important when you're doing listening and speaking. Speaking, some people have different interactional practices from what you might expect. You know, even in a classroom, if you ask your students to talk about something and you say, okay, who's willing to talk about this topic? Some people will immediately put up their hand and they're ready to talk, where others are reluctant. Now, there's all kinds of dispositions of people, you know, in a classroom, and it's the same in a test. I was recently talking to, and there was a young man from Africa, and he commented on a task related to a picture description. The picture was 3 people on a beach. And he said, when I saw this picture, I just said, there are 3 people on the beach. What else am I supposed to say? The task said, describe the photograph in 1 minute. He said, there is nothing to say. So, you know, so there is an issue here. What do people think an interaction should be? What do people think a description should be? Of course, he could describe more, but his question was, well, why should I? What is there? I mean, there are a lot of things I can say about this, but, you know, I can say, he told me, I can say I never went to a beach. I've never been to a beach, because I'm from Africa, in the middle of Africa. I've never been to a beach, but is that relevant or not relevant? I could say, oh, it's only these rich people who go to the beach. Should I say that? So he went on like that, and it's a very useful point to think about. What are the socio-cultural interactional practices of our students? How do they interact with each other in their first language as well as in their second language? And this is a whole field of study called conversation analysis. For those of you who are doing conversation analysis, you know about turn taking, how people take turns, how people take the floor, how people yield the floor, how people start a conversation, how people end a conversation, how people don't end the conversation, even though you may want them to end the conversation, especially phone calls. You know, you want to stop, but there are some people who don't want to stop. And, you know, so there's intra-cultural practices. There's between you and a friend, maybe there's certain kinds of dynamics, but across your friend, among friends in the country, you may have a variety of, you know, interactional practices because of your disposition and so on. Elicitation refers to tasks, how the test makes you do things, talk or read or write, and there's the proficiency dimension. Okay. Here are some examples of scenarios. Here is one example. Have a look at it. This is called Getting to Know series, and I designed this for teachers who I was talking to. I was talking to a group of teachers, large group of teachers in Australia, for the English Australia group. And one of the things I thought that would be useful for them is for them to understand how international students who go to them deal with certain problems before going there. And one was getting your visa. So I thought this would be authentic, it would be meaningful, and it should have a solution, it should have a resolution at the end. So getting your visa is one idea. Getting to know your program before you go there. So you want to go to a particular university in Australia. What should the program give you? What are you looking for? You can have a scenario based on that. Getting to know your professors, very important if you are going into advanced study, research program. Getting to know your classmates, getting to know your city. So these are examples. I'll give you one long example in a little bit. There's also preparing to speak. Students are often asked, to speak on something. In a language learning class, or in a history class, or a biology class, philosophy class, management class, leadership class, they're asked to say something about a topic. How do our students do in this task? And this could be a scenario, a whole scenario where you listen to a prep talk, if you like, or some kind of talk that tells you how to speak, what kinds of language to use. Then you can ask the test taker to develop some notes, in maybe bulleted points. You can have a rebuttal. You can draft slides, and then you can ask the test taker to speak. Now, I've not developed this into an actual test, but it's an example. Okay, here is a full example of a scenario. So this is from a paper I published with Coral Chin and Cecilia Zhao called Developing a Scenario-Based Language Assessment in an Asian University. It was published in Language Assessment Quarterly. On the next slide, you have the abstract in English and Mandarin, and it tells you all about it. So I won't stop there. I will go to the next few slides. The first slide after this is the flow of tasks in this scenario. Okay? So this is how we as a team in the laser group, as we were called, at the University of Macau, we designed this scenario. The first task was to read information about visas. So students want to get a visa to go to Australia. Okay, what do they have to do? Well, they've got to go to the website and figure out what are the ways they can get a visa, student visa. There's a lot of information on almost any country's website. It tells you all the ways you can get a visa, the purposes you can get a visa for, the duration, the cost, the application, all that stuff. After that, we asked them to watch a video, an actual interview between a visa officer and a student. So the student asking the visa officer questions, the visa officer giving answers and giving guidance, that sort of thing. So the students have read something and they have listened to something. Then the third task was for them to read and fill out a form. So they had to read the form, an actual visa form, and fill out the form. And the last task was to write a justification for why they should get a visa. This is also a typical requirement to get a visa. So they have to write 100 words or 150 words. For different purposes, the length is specified accordingly, and the argumentation is also specified accordingly. So for the student visa, it was not so complicated, but if you want to go and work there, or if you have a family reunification, there's more explanation to give in the last task. So here are the tasks in this scenario, one by one. Okay. Now this is shown in a summarized form on the screen. There was a lot more. So you need a visa to enter Australia. These are the different types you can get for different purposes and different contexts. You can go to study in a university or college or high school, seminary, conservatory, or a language training program. And generally, if you're a citizen, you've got to get a visa, and you have a student visa in Australia, you must be admitted to a course, and this goes on and on for a whole web page. Okay, so students have to read that, understand the context. So, you can have students read this, and you can have a task at the end of this. We did not have a task at the end of this. You can have a reading task at the end of this. Could be fill in the blanks, it could be just information check. Did the readers, did the students get all the information, or did they miss some information? If they missed information, they could go back and correct it. So this particular test was on a computer, so they could enter the information and then go back if they wanted a page, come back, edit it, So you could have a self-assessment of the information that you wanted them to focus on. So that's the first task. The second task was watching a video. This is an actual video of two students, actually both of them were students. They took this role, one as a student on the left and the visa officer on the right, and the visa officer is handing over some a page, and the visa officer in the conversation, they say, they exchange information. The visa officer says, "Where's your passport photograph?" And she says, "Well, your photograph is the wrong type. It doesn't have a white background. And do you have a copy of your passport page? No, you don't have one. So you got to come back with a passport page copy." Typical kinds of things that you would get in a visa office. So we recreated this with our own script, with our own students doing this. And the students could take notes on the right side, and then they had to fill out this form, which was like an information check. Now, we didn't do this for the first task, but you can do this for the first task. We did this for the second task. The third task was filling out a visa form. So this is a typical visa form in most, if you want to get a student visa, you have particular, name and information, that sort of thing. You need to choose the type of visa, purpose and type, and documents that have to be submitted along, and so on. So all this has to be checked off. You've got to fill out the form, sign it, all this. So they did it as though they were actually doing a visa form application. And the final task was to write a justification. So this is a screenshot of a Word document. So they had to fill out the space in about 50 words, say the purpose of your visit, your study plan, and the benefits you will get from the program. This is a typical task that a student has to fill out to get a visa. So these are 4 tasks under one scenario. And the reason we think this is a good model is very authentic. And it brings to the test taker 3 or 4 or 5 meaningful scenarios instead of like 15 reading passages and listening passages which have no relevance to them or may have some relevance. It's a hit and miss. They get, typical assessments give you 6 or 7 passages to read, 5 or 6 passages to listen to. They're unrelated topics. One is about 3 kinds of rocks, and the second one is about personality, and the third one is about some food deprivation, world hunger. So the students are just going around the world with their mental schema, just jumping from here to there, everywhere. We think that's not a good idea. We think there should be some unity in the topics, the content, and the tasks. And we should have an end point or a goal. This one has a goal at the end. You fill out the submission form and you feel, okay, you've listened to some information, you've read some information, you've filled out the application form, and you've written the justification. So it's like a sequence of tasks which brings you to the point where in the real world you would send off this application. So we think that sort of scheme of tasks, a system of tasks, is a better fit for an assessment, particularly in terms of authenticity and cognition. In order to satisfy some research interests that we also had, we did several tasks that most researchers would do, but test developers may not do, or may do, in order to satisfy other issues related with test development. One is we wanted to know, linguistically, in terms of linguistic features, where are these texts? How difficult are they? How easy are they? What does it have? So we used Cometrics, which is a freely available software to do an analysis of all the texts. And this is a summary of the results. This Cometrics component scores talks about narrativity. There's only 16%, and that simply says that your texts were not narration-like. Yes, they were not stories. Narration is typically when you tell a story. It was low on narration. Low on narration makes the task difficult. High on narration makes a task easier. But our sample here had syntactic simplicity. It was quite simple, not very simple, quite simple. Word concreteness, very concrete. It was all about concrete things. There was nothing abstract in the content, so that made it easier. And 2 types of cohesion, that was not too bad either. So in all, the Fleshkin cake grade level was 11. Co-metrics rated it as 10, but both of them were not very far away from each other, 10 and 11. And they give you a sort of short description of what kind of task it is. Now, this type of analysis might be useful if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 scenarios or 3 or 4 texts, and you want to say, okay, which one is the easiest here? Or which one is the most difficult? What features does text 1 have? What features does text 2 have? Sometimes teachers, by just looking at it, may not be able to assess very well what is easy, what is difficult, or which passage has which features, or more of which features and less of which features. So these sort of automated tools make it quite easy. There are other tools. I think Text Inspector is another one. Lex Tutor is another one. So these are software you can use to figure out what is the range of difficulty or easiness of your reading or listening material. Here's a summary of 3 tasks, 3 scenarios we analyzed. And it may look like a lot, but it's not that complicated. So here's the first scenario, applying for a visa. There were 3 tasks there. So we identified the skill levels, skills involved in each task. So the first one was independent reading. Second one was independent listening. The third one was integrated reading, listening, and writing. And we have a description of the task. We had the type of response format, multiple choice, short answer, constructed writing, number of items for each, co-metrics analysis. We did not have co-metrics analysis there. Fleshkin cake. And Lex Tutor was another one. And we also did a CA analysis, conversation analysis, wherever there was conversation. So in this case, there was this conversation. There were 10 turns in the conversation, and the speed was 123 words per minute. Now this is important because we know that conversation turns, number of turns is important. You don't want a monologue. You don't want one person talking for a lot of time. That's like listening to a monologue. But we want them to listen to a conversation. So conversations generally are kind of short. There are many turns between the participants. Also, the speed is important. This is 123 words per minute. It's moderate speed. It's not very fast. Normal speed is about 110. I'm probably talking at about 110, 120 words per minute. And you'll know that if you're interested in this sort of research, the faster the pace of speech, the more difficult it is to store information and retrieve information. So the slower the speed, the easier it is, particularly if you're learning the language. So speed is an important criterion in terms of, related to difficulty. The second scenario, which I did not show you, was about tourism. Here they had to read an article and review summary points, and then watch a video about a professor giving an assignment. And that was that. And this was, the first task was at an A2 level. We think the task for getting a visa was not very high level, not too demanding. It was A2, this one is B1, and McDonald's changing its recipe, it was kind of like a B2. So we had information like this on all of them, just to give us a sense of what are these tasks and what is the content doing. Here is a distinct example. The speed here is 176 words per minute, this particular listening task, and this one is 146, but it has 31 turns. This one has 9 turns, this one has 10 turns. So here we started with a slightly slower speed, we went to a faster speed, came back down to a slower speed. So turns, very important, turn taking, and words per minute in terms of speed. Okay, so this was the analysis that we did of the tasks. Here's another type of information. This was a sample score report which we produced. And in this score report, we gave test takers a lot of information. We said, okay, here's your first one. Here are the tasks. This is how you did. You got 10 out of 10, you got 6 out of 9, you got 10 out of 10. You got 26 out of 29. This is a particular student. Here's the second scenario, 17 out of 29. Third scenario, 42 out of 50, 108. And you got a 79%, 85 out of 185 is the score, 79%, and we think that's like a B2. So this person got a B2 overall. But these are more individual points that we could share with the test taker. We also did something that organizations hadn't done at that point. This may not be that great, but we thought every score report should be followed by some kind of score interpretation. This is at the generic level. So we are saying anyone who gets a B2 will get these kinds of information. This information may be more specific because they are related to CEFR, kinds of can-do statements. These are made up by teachers at the B2 level. So the teacher said if we should have this type of information for reading and this type of information for listening. Now, it's not tailor-made to each test taker. That's the disadvantage. But the advantage is we're able to at least offer some information rather than no information. Now, I know that LTTC is making stronger moves in this regard, bringing language learners to build more capability, rather than to just give them a score and to let them go and figure it out themselves, which was the way of the past. Okay. I wanted to tell you that there is one well-known test that is using role plays. It looks like scenarios. They don't call them scenarios, they call them role plays. And this is the occupational English test used in Australia for health professionals. So if you're a medical doctor or a pharmacist or a nurse and you seek employment in Australia, and if you're from not Australia, you have to take the OET. And it's a good example of a test, in practice that is out there, that is administered on a regular basis for individuals who want to go and work in Australia. And I'm told it's available in Australia and in many Southeast Asian countries. So if you're interested in looking at a test in the real world that uses role plays, where the test taker becomes a doctor, or the test taker is a nurse, or a test taker is a patient, and you learn to interact with your partner, who may be a doctor or a patient. Okay, questions to consider regarding SBA, scenario-based assessment. How many scenarios do you need in a full test? This is a perennial question that I get asked, and we keep thinking that it should be anywhere from 2 to 6 or 8, depending on the purpose of the assessment and the decision making that an organization needs. This particular test that we designed had 6 scenarios, and I only showed you 3, and I only illustrated with 1, but 6 scenarios in all. And it took about 2 hours of test taking time. So that's one consideration. How to score assessments? Should it be holistic or analytic or task-based? And an important consideration is, excuse me, how to design a rubric or a system by which you can grade a performance. Should it be just correct or incorrect answers? What about if you have some speaking and some writing? Should it be based on length of responses? Should it be linguistic features? You're looking at grammar, vocabulary, and discourse. Should it be logical problems? Should we look at, does it make sense what the person is saying or what the person is writing. And then how do you assemble scores? Should it be integrative and independent? In our case, we showed them both, independent and integrative, because our teachers wanted both independent scores for listening, speaking, reading, writing, and we had integrative scores as well. And we also had an overall score, because many people are interested in overall score. We did not give any part scores for any of the different tasks, which I think your organization here, LTTC, is doing. So we did not give information, say, as to how they performed on each of the tasks. We grouped them. Okay, and finally, this turned out to be the highlight of my talk for the English Australia group. How to develop a list of useful scenarios. And I just threw this out as a possibility that we should get views from test takers. And this became a big hit because they reported back a year later and said, we've been asking students who arrive in Australia, what do they want to read about? What do they want to listen to? And they've been enjoying getting information through a survey and repurposing some of their materials using that survey information. So this might be something that you might want to do as well in your own classrooms. I mean, we're all grown-ups and we think we know best, right? But do we? Do we know best when it comes to the content our students want to read or listen to? Do you know what they want to talk about? Do you know what they want to write about? Sometimes, with the best of our efforts, we are, doing X when they want to do Y. So we should find a way to match their interests with our goals. Another way, and this may be a much more complex way, another way is to consider some kind of learner autonomy by which you have a toggle switch in the beginning of the test when they say, I want a test which focuses on X. It could be based on their academic major. It could be, I want a test that's focused on science. I want a test that's focused on management. I want a test that's focused on engineering. So they get topics that are related to their field. You don't have to have all topics related to their field. You can have a core that is non-specific and then have some parts that are to satisfy them. Because we think always, we know the 6 passages they should read. No, not really. So you can try, these days with computers, you can try with a click of a button to give them what they want. Okay, do you want X? Do you want Y? Do you want Z? Now, they may not make the best choices. So we know from the old research done by Caroline Clapham at the University of Lancaster, many decades ago, she studied this issue of asking test takers to choose. And so some of them chose, say, science and engineering. And in experimental studies, she found that the students who took science and engineering module did not do as well as students, and did not do as well as themselves when they performed on the general module. So sometimes our specialized topic areas might become too complex and too deep. So if you want to do science, you may have to do what is generally called popular science, not very deep science. So it could be general science, could be science policy, could be science and society, something like that, which is general, but has a scientific slant. If you want to have a business module, you can have a business module, but not too deep into business that they are completely lost. So this is another example where we can make some headway into providing learner autonomy and test taker autonomy so that we don't impose on them everything about the content and the tasks. We let them choose the content and the task type. So one is the content and one is the task, asking them for information, ideas, and the other is having sort of different modules or having part modules. You have a core of a test which is general English, and then you have a second part which is much more specific to their interests. So where can you use all of this stuff that I've been talking about? Well, certainly you can use it in low-stakes contexts. You can use it in your classrooms. As a teacher, if you have the autonomy to do it, you can try it out. You can try it out once a month or once at the end of a term, where instead of giving them random topics on a variety of things, try some scenarios. You know, a scenario that would meet their needs and is authentic for them. You can use it in language learning centers, classrooms, settings. You can also do it in pairs or in groups. It doesn't always have to be solo. As far as language learning goes, language learning can also take place in pairs and in groups. And if you're not really concerned about getting individual scores, you can give test takers pair scores or group scores. So, you know, if you have a language learner in different pairs, in different contexts, you can figure out that who is the strong language learner. It doesn't always have to be an individually taken test. It could be done in pairs. So it could be collaborative. It could be student-directed, as I was saying a few minutes ago, talking about learner autonomy. You could have the students direct what tests they want to take and you know, what content they would like to take. In general, it can be used for formative assessment, or what we call assessment for learning, which is the goal of today's talk, was to promote the idea that assessment should not be seen outside the scope of teaching and learning. Assessment should be seen as an integral part of teaching and learning, and assessment should be for learning. Okay, all right, so with that, I will stop. These are the two references. The reference I gave you earlier on language assessment, and the wonderful scenario-based language assessment video on YouTube by James Purpura. Thank you very much for listening.